Jim with Twisted Hobbies. Today we're building the Super Extra. Today we're going to be building the Super Extra 1 meter. First off, I went to the website, I downloaded the manual, I printed it out. That way I'll be able to follow right along. I have a power combo, I have the receiver, and I have some foam tack ready to go. Let's get into the build. First I'm going to take everything in the kit out of the box. And then I'm going to find my surfaces that need to be folded over. Then I'm going to fold those over for about an hour or so. Keep in mind, these are profiles, and if you pull them too far, you can actually break the hinge a little bit. It's usually not too big a deal to fix that up, but just be careful on those wings. The other ones, they can be folded all the way over. While those are sitting there, this is a great time to bind your receiver, to zero your servos, calibrate your ESC, and verify your motor direction. So I always do that at this point. There's a whole video on this in the description so you can see how that's done. And now we're ready to move on to the horizontal fuselage. First thing we do is cut that apart, get some parchment paper underneath it. We are not going to be gluing those together at this point, but we are going to be gluing the wings on. And the way that I do this is I spread the glue on, I push it together, and then I pull it apart for about a minute. And then when you give it a final push together, that will give it a permanent bond. Next up, we're going to be cutting our slot for the fuselage spar. And to do this, I use a straight edge, and I'm going to line it right up with the line between the fuselage halves. And you'll see that here I am cleaning up the plywood stiffener. It's got some residue from the laser cutting on it, so we just want to make sure that it's nice and clean before we touch our plane. So I open up that slot so it's able to fit all the way down. And then we're going to use the slot cutter that Twisted Hobbies sells. I really like this. You can also just use an X-Acto blade that's taped off to depth, but I really like using the slot cutter. It just makes it so easy. Here I'm measuring to make sure it's going to be the same distance away from the front leading edge of the wing. And then I cut that slot about 4 millimeters deep, enough to fully bury it in the slot there. I get it dry fit. Everything looks great on the dry fit, so then we are ready to put glue into it. And once I get the spar in place, I'm going to use a small flathead screwdriver to make sure it's all the way down below the surface of the foam. And then we're going to repeat that entire process on the top side of the plane. Again, make sure that you're using your parchment paper underneath. That way you're not sticking to the table while you're doing the other side. I leave the excess carbon fiber rod sticking out the edge of the wing, and then I'll trim that off later. Next up, we're going to be working on the elevator and putting in all of the stiffeners for it. So I trimmed those to length, and then I dry fit them in place. Everything looks great, except for I needed to open it up just a little bit more on one of them. That's why we dry fit. Then fill it with glue, get it down level with the foam, and then we'll do the other side as well. Next, we'll be attaching the horizontal stabilizer and elevator to the horizontal fuselage. And I just fill that area with glue and get it into place. Then I verify the wingtip to tail tip distance is the same on both sides. And then we're going to flip it over and do the stiffeners that go on the horizontal fuselage. I dry fit these two long pieces in first, and then I get those glued into place, and then I cut and glue in the ones that zigzag down. And I just use some diagonal cutters to cut these as I put them into place. That seems to work out really well. I take them all back out, add some glue. And once those stiffeners are in place, I'll again just use a screwdriver to push them all the way in. We flip the plane back over. And here I'm gluing in the landing gear support from the bottom. And then we're ready to start on our servos for our ailerons. So I'm going to put those horns on, get them placed, make sure the dry fit looks nice. I cut a little slot for one of the wires so that way it can go underneath the fuselage and I can have all my wires on one side.
I find if you push the servos down into place, it makes a little indentation where the mounting tabs are, and then you're able to cut the little slot for the mounting tabs. They slide right in, and then you can get those glued in permanently. I used a straight edge here to figure out where my aileron control horns were going to go. I was able to mark that with a pencil and then cut the slot for those and get them into place. A little bit of glue on those, and then we are ready to start working on the aileron push rods. So we'll sand up one end of that push rod and get it ready to install. Put a little bit of super glue on it and then make sure it's fully seated inside of the clevis there. We do that for each of them, and then we're going to thread these brass inserts into the other clevises. Make sure they go in about halfway, and then you can get them installed on your servos. The reason we're doing this is because it depends on where you placed your control horn on your aileron, so we have to make sure that you're making it exactly the right size. Also, make sure that your aileron is perfectly centered when you're getting this fine-tuning taken care of. I use the measurement from one to guide me on the other. You have a little bit of wiggle room when you're gluing it into the brass piece. And I had to do quite a bit of sanding on the ends of those to be able to get them to fit in easily. And before we glue it in, we just want to make sure that the surface is centered. So that I get that set on both of those. And now my aileron push rods are all done. And now we're moving on to the fuselage stiffeners for the underside of the plane. So again, I'm just using those diagonal cutters to cut my pieces. And then we'll pull them back out, get some glue into there. Then we'll push all those pieces back into place. And then we'll let it set up. I'm going to put some batteries on top of it, make sure it dries nice and flat. Next up, we're going to put on the lower part of the vertical fuselage, but before we do that, let's get the elevator servo installed. So we put the horn on it. The horn is going to extend through the body, and then it's going to poke out the other side a little bit. And then we can get ready with the lower part of the vertical fuselage. I like to line it up so that I know where I'm going to be able to put glue and where not to. And then we're going to push it into place and use our square to make sure that it is perfectly perpendicular. Now we find the top part of the landing gear. We get those cut out and glued in. And then we're going to work on drilling the holes for the landing gear. Drill that on both sides, and then thread the gear through the plane. And then these little hold downs that actually hold the gear to the plane, they have a little cutout, but I would recommend flipping them over so it's flat against them. Otherwise, it just has a little too much play. Next up is going to be the wheel assemblies. First, I like to set all the parts out. Then we're going to open up the wheel hubs just a little bit so that way the bolts will move freely through there. I had to use a couple different sizes of drill bit to get those to open, and then still had to go back at it with the drill. And now finally those are the perfect size, and we are ready to continue the assembly. As you put these together, we're just going to make sure that the little tabs that hold on to the wheel pants are facing the wheel. And then we're going to get that installed on each side of the landing gear. Once we get both of those wheel assemblies onto the gear, then we will put the pants together, and they just get glued. Then those get glued onto the, we'll call those the wheel pant holders, the little white pieces. And then our landing gear is done. Next, we'll go on to the elevator pushrod and pushrod guides. So I'm getting all those guides put in, just making sure they're all lined up. Then I'm going to insert the little white piece into the clevis and then get that attached to the elevator. And then I'll be able to thread in the little brass insert onto the other clevis, get it connected, and then trim off the pushrod at the correct length. and then get that glued in together. If you want that a little more secure, you can use a small piece of heat shrink to go over the brass piece and pushrod. Now we're going to glue the canopy onto the upper fuselage, and we just coat that with foam tack, press it together, pull it apart for a minute, and then push it back together. We're also going to put on the servo for the rudder, get that into place, and now we need to glue in the motor mount, but I don't like it the color that it is, so I'm going to spray paint it black. I'll also do that on the tail skid while I'm at it. Okay, we've glued in that motor mount, and now we are ready to glue in the top part of the vertical fuselage. So I apply glue where it needs to be, get it pressed into place, and then I triple check to make sure everything is perpendicular with my square. And now we can install the tail skid. So I just cut a little slot for that. Pretty straightforward. Now we're gluing the vertical stabilizer and rudder in place. No drama there, pretty straightforward. And now we're working on the push rod for the rudder. Same process as before on this. The only real difference being that it's a ball socket joint here at the servo horn. So now here we are installing all of the pushrod guides, and I'm just gluing those into place, making sure they're all facing the same direction, and then testing it. That looks good. Now I'm going to glue in the rudder control horn, and then we'll cut off the push rod, put it into the brass insert, and then glue it into place. Next up is going to be the side force generators. We just cut those apart, make sure that they are centered. There's a little divot that shows you, and then we get that on the other side as well. Then we'll be putting all the motor parts together. Then we'll attach the motor to the motor mount, and you'll see there's a little cutout for the wires to go down. Now I'm going to be mounting the ESC and the receiver, and then I'll be tidying up all the wiring and trying to keep it all neat and organized. Next up is prop installation, and then before I do that, I'm probably going to balance it. And I'm using this balancer that I got from Twisted Hobbies, and it turns out that this prop is perfectly balanced. I tried it twice just to make sure, but yeah, it's perfectly balanced. So I get it put on, and now I am making my marks for my center of gravity. I'm going to be using those marks right there to balance, and turns out that that battery needs to be pretty far back. I'm actually going to cut a slot in my vertical fuselage, so I'll have the battery mounted in a permanent location. But before I do that, I kind of want to just put a Velcro strap on. That way I can do any fine tuning that I need to. So eventually I do go back and cut a slot there, and so the battery is able to fit snugly into there. Then the final thing that I'm going to do is mount the XT60 connector through the horizontal fuselage, so that way the battery will just plug straight in. So I press it down, sort of make an imprint, and then use the X-Acto blade to go around where that imprint was made, and then I'm able to push the connector all the way up through the body of the plane, and then I'll glue it into place. Make sure you don't get any glue inside of that connector. And then once that is done, I think that we can call this a completed plane build. Okay, let's take a look at the Maiden flight. So right off the bat, today is kind of a windy day and probably not ideal for doing a maiden flight. And on this plane, I did have some challenges with my trimming. So you'll see I'm going to be glancing down a few times to look at my trim buttons. I'm having a problem with it diving forward a little too much, so I'm having to pull some back elevator on the trim, and it's also wanting to roll to the left side because that's the side that I have the battery attached to, where usually I have the ESC and the receiver on the left side of the plane, and then I have the battery to balance it out on the right side, but I had put it on the left side, so it's got all of the weight twisting the plane, so I just had to accommodate for that. I don't have the battery positioned permanently because I will cut a slot in the vertical fuselage. And I wanted to use this opportunity to actually go ahead and make sure it was all balanced and that the CG was in the right place before I cut the slot. So since then, I have cut the slot and it balances much, much better. It's perfect and does exactly what I'm looking for. But I did struggle here a little bit with the wind and with it being not in the best center of gravity. But that's okay. That's the point of doing a Maiden, and they can't always be great. So here I'm just working on some different maneuvers, seeing how it is able to react, seeing how tightly it does those rolls, and overall it's been working really great. Since this flight, I believe I've done probably 15 more flights on it, and it really reminds me a lot of my Revolto. Flies really well, likes to tumble, feels pretty precise. Overall, I'm really digging it. The weight of the plane came out at 420 grams, and the battery that I'm using is a 3S1000, and I think that's just about the perfect size for this. Okay, I won't bore you guys too much more with my flying. Hopefully this video has helped you with the building of your Super Extra, and hopefully you enjoy flying it as much as I do.